Okay, great. Thanks again for joining. Good afternoon. We have almost 50 individuals already online with us. We're going to start with some introductions here. I'm Norman Ruano. I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Illinois Works at the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. Welcome. Today is our Illinois Works NOFO applicant group negotiation. We'll discuss in a minute what that means and the timelines and the items that are very important. I'm going to hand it over now to my colleague, Monica, who will introduce herself, and then Dan Martinez will introduce himself. Please go ahead, Monica.
Sure. Thank you, Norman. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monica Pruitt. I am one of the pre-apprenticeship grant managers here at the Office of Illinois Works. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Monica. Dan, if you could please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Martinez. I'm one of the programmatic grant managers with the Illinois Works Pre-Apprenticeship Program. I'm glad to welcome you all here. And one note on the very last slide, and we'll be sending out this slide deck to everyone. You will have my email address and Monica's email address. So if you do have questions, just wanted to let you know that.
Thank you, Dan. As Dan mentioned, we will be providing the slide deck to all the participants today. We will also make the recording available. If we could please go move ahead. This session is being recorded, so we will make that available to you also once we have access to it after we finish the presentation today. So it's important to know what this is all about. This here is a group negotiation meeting. Instead of negotiating individually with each grant applicant that the evaluators have identified for us to be able to negotiate with, we will be conducting one-on-one negotiations with the total of 15 different grantees that we're conducting one-on-one negotiations with to address a variety of flags the evaluators might have placed on their application. But if we don't do one-on-one negotiation, this is the negotiation meeting, which is a group negotiation that applies to everybody. Keep in mind also that if we are doing one-on-one negotiation meetings with you, you still have to attend this meeting, as there are some flags that will be identified in this meeting that will also have to be addressed as part of your application. How does this come about? When you apply for a grant with the state of Illinois, we have to follow a law called GATA, G-A-T-A. And as part of that law, we have to send your application out to be evaluated by independent evaluators. We at the Office of Illinois Works do not evaluate your application. Independent evaluators will evaluate it. They will score your application. And if they feel that your application could potentially be funded, they may include flags on the application that need to be addressed before we can make a recommendation to our director of DCEO for funding. So some of the flags we'll address here are applied to everybody. Make sure your application has address or addresses those flags. We will send you an email after we finish this with what needs to be done and the date when it needs to be done. And if you do have one-on-one meetings, we will add some more flags based on those meetings to your application, okay? Your participation in this meeting does not mean that you will actually receive a grant. It just means that we are going through the evaluation process. For you to be able to receive a grant, all the flags that have been identified in your application need to be addressed, are required to be addressed. And if you do so successfully, then we would recommend to the director of DCEO for you to get a grant. She's the only person that can make a decision in relation to that. So you may or may not get a grant even after you address the flags. It's really up to her. So that's the way the process works. Are there any questions related to this process before we move on to the rest of the content? Monica, please let me know if there are any questions in the chat that are placed in the chat.
At present, there are no questions.
Okay, great. So moving on, Dan. Thank you. So as I mentioned, there will be an email that you will be receiving. As soon as we finish this meeting, you will receive that email. And we do need your responses on letterhead by 5 p.m. Thursday, November 21st. So as you can see, it's a quick turnaround. We have a deadline of when we're supposed to be presenting all of these grant applications to our director, which is next Tuesday. And we want to make sure that we can make that deadline so that those that do get a grant can proceed to the next steps to receive a grant agreement quickly this year. So again, 5 p.m. this Thursday, the 21st, is when we need your responses on letterhead addressing the various flags on this that we're going to be covering today. Now we would like to see who's present. All applicants to the NOFO were required to attend this meeting. So if you could please enter in the chat your name, your title, and the organization you represent, we would appreciate it. Monica will monitor that and we will keep track of that. Again, name, title, the organization you represent so that we can verify if all grant applicants have actually attended this event. If you have entered your name or name and last name, but no title and no name of the organization, if you could please go back and enter your name, your title, and the name of your organization. Moving on, Dan. Any questions at this point before we go on to talk about the grant award process itself?
So Norman, there had just been one question in the chat regarding the timeline, but I know Dan will be getting to that shortly. So I have advised that we will be discussing the timeline shortly.
Yeah, great. That's what we're going to be talking about right now. Okay, if there are no questions, let's talk about the grant award process and then we'll provide a timeline for you. Okay, so as we have discussed, we issued a NOFO in July. Large number of organizations applied, submitted proposals for them to be funded through that NOFO. The next step, once we reach the deadlines for submission, is that all applications that met the criteria for us being able to send them to review are then sent to review. Again, as I mentioned, it's an independent review process. Teams of independent evaluators score the applications using a rubric based on the criteria and the NOFO. And based on that, they may come back and say decline to fund, or they may say we recommend that this organization can receive a grant if these items are addressed, right? So, and typically there are several items that are flagged, right? Some of them may be related to budget, some of them may be related to program structure or timelines, some of it may be related to staffing or partnerships, some of it may be related to some of the guidance in the NOFO that was not adequately addressed in the proposal, right? So it depends on what that particular proposal is what the evaluators may come back with. What we then do is that we negotiate, we grab those items, those flags, and negotiate. In this case, we have about half of the applications they reviewed where the flags are general that need to be addressed, which is the reason why you're here. But if you did submit a proposal and we asked for a one-on-one negotiation, we started those one-on-one negotiations last week. We have done almost half of them so far. We still have another 7 or 8 that need to be completed this week. And those negotiations are more to address the extra flags related to a particular proposal that came again as a result of the evaluation. Once those negotiations are completed, included this group negotiation, then we will present to the director for those organizations that have successfully and effectively cleared their flags. We will present to the director recommendations for funding based on the evaluators and clearing of the flags the evaluators mentioned. And for those that the director approves, then we go into the notification of intent to award. You will receive a notification indicating that we intend to award, give a grant to a particular organization. However, there are other steps that have to be completed, such as an ICQ, a PRA, and then later the NOSA has to be signed. Those are more documents related to risk. You have to fill out those documents so that the state can calculate the risk of giving you a grant, and then those risk factors are included in the NOSA and then later in the grant agreement. So that's the way the process works. So we are in the negotiation stages, and then we'll move on to execute the next steps. Okay, so here's the timeline. I know someone was asking about the timeline. So right now we are doing the negotiations, both the group negotiations and the individual grantee negotiations. Again, if you get chosen for a one-on-one negotiation, we will reach out to you and schedule a meeting with you. Typically, it's about 30 minutes where we go one by one on all the flags that were placed on your application. The responses for this particular group negotiation are due on the 21st, as I mentioned earlier. If you are doing a one-on-one negotiation, you may receive a unique due date for your responses, because on your response, you have to address the extra flags that are included with your application. We are planning, as I mentioned earlier, to present to the Director of DCEO on 11/26. We can only present and recommend to the director funding those applications that have successfully and effectively cleared all the flags that were placed on their application. So keep that in mind. It's a quick turnaround here. And then by 11/29, the notifications will go out once we secure approval from the director, indicating which grantees will receive. We'll move on to the next steps to ideally give them a grant. The NOSA, the PRAs, the ICQs have to be done in order for us to successfully issue a grant. So it's important to keep that in mind. For grantees that at that particular point are declined, we decline to fund, our director declines to fund, they will receive a notification also indicating that DCO has declined to fund their program. It is our expectation this year that the grant agreements, and in this case, we're talking about grant agreements for everybody that applied through the NOFO process, will receive a grant agreement early in Q1 of 2025. As you may know, and then we'll speak a little bit more about this later in the presentation, we have now transitioned almost all the grants. About 90% of Illinois Works grants have been transitioned from the Office of Grants Management to our own financial grant managers. I had indicated that in the last quarterly meeting during the conference that was coming. It was activated in November and will continue on. So by the beginning of 2025, all grants would have been transitioned to our office, and all new grants will be issued by our office, so that there will no longer be need to interface with the Office of Grant Management team. Those that are new into our system will not experience that, but those of you that are old in the system and have applied to renew your funding through the NOFO process know what I'm talking about. So, but again, it's our intention early in Q1 of 2025 for us, the Office of Illinois Works, to issue your grant agreements so that we can get going and process payments for you as early as possible in the grant year. Any questions about that timeline?
There are none in the chat.
Okay, great. If you do have any questions, you can at this point unmute your line if you're interested in asking it verbally. Otherwise, you can certainly place it in the chat and we'll address it. Moving on to the next slide, Dan, please. Okay, so now talking about the grant timeline. If you are awarded a grant, as I mentioned, you will receive notification, uh, to go through the process, the NOSA, and the ICQ processes and such. And those that receive a grant, the grant term, the program year is January 1st, 2025 through December 31st, 2025. So that's typically our program year. It's important for you to know that there will be, once again, grantee onboarding, 20 plus hours of professional development training will be delivered starting in mid-January and running through February. Mid to the third week of January, similar to what we did last year. We're planning 1 to 2 day onboarding sessions face to face to be able to do as much of the onboarding as soon as possible. And also, what's important there is that you get to meet new grantees, people that are located in different places of the state, doing similar work that you're doing. Some of the programs will come in as part of our accelerator program. They will also get to meet organizations that in the future would serve as peer mentors for them. But this will again happen starting in the middle to the third week of January and running through the end of February. So that's the onboarding schedule that will kick in early in the year. So, and also the other thing that's important is in-person professional development meetings will occur, as I mentioned, January. That's when a couple of days of the onboarding will be done face to face. We also, once again, will hold our regional meeting in May, and once again, our annual conference in October. That's part of the professional development system of Illinois Works. Participant training, if you wonder when you can begin your training, if you're a new grantee, you would typically begin in March. Some of them a little later after March, given how much setup they have to do. If you are a renewal grantee using the NOFO process, you could potentially run training before March, but once again, it has to be pre-approved through the work plan, and based on your work plan, and we will then let you know if you can run training before March. But new grantees typically run training starting March, and after that, all the way to the end of the year. So that's the timeline in terms of the grant itself. Once you have been approved to proceed with funding and receiving a grant. Go ahead, Dan, to the next one.
Norman, there is a question in the chat.
Yes, go ahead.
So Damien asked, would there be any reason for denial of the grant if they address all of the flags in their response on November the 21st? And I'm assuming some others may have that same question.
Well, I mean, it really depends how those flags are addressed, right? I mean, I'll give you an example, okay? If you proposed let's say, to run a carpentry pre-apprenticeship program, everybody that knows about Illinois Works knows that we do not approve a pre-apprenticeship program specifically for a trade, carpentry or electricity or operators, plumbers. We approve pre-apprenticeship programs that are general so that people can then transition to any pre-apprenticeship program of their choice. So if your proposal if your grant proposal is to run a carpentry one, and then when we sit down and say this is a flag from the evaluators, you need to address it. You have to run a general pre-apprenticeship program. You may respond on November 21st and say your response may be, I'm arguing why it's so important to run a carpentry pre-apprenticeship program. I can tell you that did not clear your flag. That you might have cleared out of 10 or 6 or 8 flags, you might have cleared 3 or 4, and then your response to the other flags is arguing why we need to let you do what you want to do. If that's what you're doing on your response, you did not address the flag. You just gave a response saying why you wanted to do what you did. And in that case, there's a strong possibility that you wouldn't get recommended to get a grant because obviously you did not address the flags that were raised by the evaluators. You're wanting to convince us that those flags that you want to do what you want to do. The problem with that is that we're not the evaluators. We are, transitioning flags to you from the evaluators. You need to address their flags and their concerns in order for us to make a recommendation for the director of DCO to approve your funding. Any other questions, Monica?
Well, we're going to ask you to delve a little deeper into what you just explained there. Damien would still like to know, besides that, if you were to clear if all flags are cleared based on their response, is there any other reason to deny the grant?
So here's that's a very important question. Our job is to transfer the flags to the applicants, let them know what the flags are, answer any questions they may have about those flags, get the responses, and then update the director on if a particular grantee has cleared all their flags or not, and if we recommend them for funding. At that point, obviously, the director is the one that makes a decision. I don't know if they take any other item into consideration. We typically, stick very rigorously to the evaluation criteria that was on the NOFO itself. You can read the NOFO. You'll be able to see the evaluation criteria there on the NOFO, and that's what we go by, and that's how we make our recommendations. I have never seen myself, a director, deny a recommendation once the flags were clear. Is there a possibility that they could? I don't know if there are other criteria they can use, but I have personally never seen the director deny a recommendation to fund an application that has successfully cleared all the flags. Again, it's an issue of clearing them, not an issue of responding to them, because you can respond to a flag and not clear it, but if you did clear all the flags, I have personally not seen a director deny funding because they clear all the flags.
Thank you, Norman. Let's see. It looks like something else just popped up here. Oh, all right. So it looks like Najee just joined us here and asked, where would we see these flags to address? So Norman, if you would like to go back maybe a little bit and talk about the email that they
Okay,
will
yeah, no,
receive.
you will receive an email with a list of flags, and if you are part of this negotiation meeting, those flags apply to everybody, and take a look at your application and see if those apply to you specifically. But if you do have a large number of flags, you will receive a call from us to do one-on-one negotiations where we will go one by one with those flags and what those are and what needs to be addressed, what needs to be done in order to address those flags.
That's all for
Okay,
now.
great. Moving on. So again, it's important for you to respond quickly and completely so that we're able to quickly address and clear those flags. Because as I mentioned, our meeting with the directors on the 26th. The other thing that's also important is that you are in good standing with the state of Illinois, including submitting your reports to the Office of Grant Management, your PPRs, your PFRs, your monthly reporting with the Office of Illinois Works as applicable. Just keep in mind that if you are not in good standing, meaning your GATA profile or you is not in good standing, or you are in stop payment list for whatever reason, we cannot give you a grant. I mean, that's just the way the state works. You have to be in good standing with those systems in order for us to be able to process a grant for you. Okay, even if you clear your flags, even if the director said proceed, we cannot technically give you a grant agreement because you are not in good standing with GATA, or you are on stop payment list. Okay, so just keep that in mind. The other thing that is also important to keep in mind is that you might have transferred already. For those of you that are renewing your grantee through the NOFO process, that we're transferring the grants from the Office of Grant Management to the Office of Illinois Works. So you might have already transferred, your grant might have already transferred, and we notified you of that. And if that is the case, your PFRs and PPRs need to be submitted to the Office of Illinois Works and not the Office of Grant Management, okay? Any other questions, Monica?
There was one question regarding the deadline to respond to the flags, but I just reminded everyone in the chat that the deadline is Thursday, November 21st at 5 o'clock, unless you are told differently during a one-on-one negotiation meeting with us.
Correct. Okay, great. Thank you. Moving on, Dan. Okay, so we have already addressed the questions. If we could please go on to the rest of the content then, please.
All right. Well, I'll take over from here. Thank you very much. And again, I just want to address the question regarding deadlines to respond to the flags. So we have met with several organizations in one-on-one meetings last week. They have been given certain dates and times that they need to respond to the flags, including this group negotiation, right? So if you've already received an email with a list of flags, you need to incorporate those flags and this meeting's flags and respond by the date that you were given on your email. If you have received an email saying that you are being scheduled for a one-on-one meeting, or you receive an email saying you are going to be scheduled this week for a one-on-one meeting, you will receive a different deadline because we're still going to be adding more flags to your plate. If you are only attending this group negotiation meeting, then your flags will be due on Thursday, the 21st at 5 p.m. Right, so hopefully that's clear for everyone. Again, if you receive an email separately, you need to follow that date. Okay. So we're going to be covering several items here regarding some of our guidance. Some of these things are guidance changes from last year. So organizations that had been with us previously, these might be new to you. Some of them are existing, guidance flags that maybe we felt the need to restate to make sure that all organizations are following these. So let me go through these. Starting with the Transition Service Coordinator. This was announced at the last quarterly meeting for those organizations that had been with us last year. Programs with budgets over $300,000 must have a full-time Transition Service Coordinator in 2025. So if your grant is awarded, you will need to have that full-time Transition Service Coordinator. So if you do have, obviously everyone has responded to the NOFO. So what we're suggesting there is if that was not already incorporated into your budget, that you will need to do so, and your staffing plan. And then programs with budgets of $300,000 or less must have a Transition Service Coordinator that is employed at least half of full-time. So that's a much longer way of saying part-time, but certainly, part-time could be 5 hours, it could be 10 hours, but that's not sufficient. So it must be at least half of full-time. I'll go ahead and take questions just on the Transition Service Coordinator topic right now. Are there any questions regarding that Transition Service Coordinator?
There's one. Does full-time mean this person can only have transition services responsibility?
Yes. So in other words, you might be a full-time employee, but if you are listed on the staffing plan and in the budget, maybe you're in the budget, you're listed as 100% of your time, but on the staffing plan, you are spending 50% of your time as a Transition Service Coordinator and 50% of your time as a data entry coordinator. You're no longer a full-time Transition Service Coordinator. So that person must be a full-time Transition Service Coordinator if your budget is over $300,000.
Okay, Dan, Tamika asked, does the title of the role have to be the same or just align with the specific role requirements?
So that's important for everyone to understand that we have in the Office of Illinois Works and the pre-apprenticeship program defined roles, right? I just alluded to two of them, the transition service coordinator and a data entry coordinator. Um, your title within your organization may be different, right? Maybe it's business and organization development, but you're a transition service coordinator in Illinois Works roles, right? So we're not asking your organization to issue new titles, to go back through their HR system and issue new titles to their employees, but you do need to identify based on our roles, who is covering the Illinois Works pre-apprenticeship roles. And in fact, in the budgets, those should be identified as well. So you can include in the budget that Dan Martinez is our vice president of business development. Then you would put / transition service coordinator, right? We want to see that all of the Illinois Works pre-apprenticeship program roles are fulfilled.
So we're going to get a little deeper. What if two roles meet this requirement? 50% from transition services, internal supporting participants' career readiness, and 50% from a business development role, external, working with employers and community.
Okay, so if I'm understanding that correctly, I think that's the same as the next question that's in the chat. Essentially, that for a program, say over $300,000 in their budget, has two individuals that will each two full-time employees that are each going to work 50% of their time in the transition service coordinator role. I believe that's what that question is, and the one afterwards. That's not our best practice, but that would, unless I'm mistaken, Norman, that would satisfy that requirement.
What's the scenario again? What are they planning to do?
That you have two full-time staff members, and they will each staff the transition service coordinator role 50% of their time, resulting in a 100% transition service coordinator role fulfillment.
Well, I mean, I don't see that in principle as not working, but it needs to be real coordination because the goal of this guidance change, is to ensure that participants really get the transition services they need from the time they enroll until they exit the program, right? So if there is true coordination of those two individuals doing what needs to be done for those individuals, that could potentially work. But if there is no coordination, that's not going to work. I mean, we just need to make sure those participants receive the transition services they need from the beginning to the end.
Okay, let's see. One more quick question about the transition coordinator. Does the transition services coordinator need to have certain credentials?
No, we do not define credentials, but certainly they need to be capable of doing their job. Individuals with experience in the construction industry, experience working with U.S. Department of Labor registered apprenticeship programs, experience working with contractors and construction-related employers, certainly would be important. But no, we do not specify the credentials that the individual must have. All right. Moving on to curriculum. So new this year, we do require that there are two training modules that are identified separately. Now, we had communicated this previously and had initially thought that they could be placed in the employability skills. They will not be. They must be their own line items or line item. So we do require a 4-hour harassment prevention training module and a 4-hour diversity and inclusion in construction training module for 2025. Those can be listed individually or they can be combined as an 8-hour training module, but they do need to be listed separately than simply part of employability skills part 2, for example. Speaking of employability skills, so previously we had a range of 32 to 40 hours of employability skills that were required. At this time, the employability skills now must total 32 hours, not including, that's a little typo on my part, sorry about that, 32 hours not including the 8 hours of harassment prevention and diversity and inclusion in construction. Another topic will be OSHA 10. So OSHA 10, we refer to OSHA 10, very simply. But when we say OSHA 10, it must always be OSHA 10 construction. There are other forms of OSHA 10, OSHA 10 general and manufacturing. But when we speak of OSHA 10, the training in your curriculum must be OSHA 10 construction. And related to that, specific guidance has always existed in the 2024 grantee manual, and it will be in the 2025 grantee manual, that utilization of CareerSafe's OSHA 10 construction training has certain requirements. Those requirements are not changing, but we felt the need to point out that that training must still be in person. And OSHA 10 cards must be uploaded at the end of the training in order for those individuals to be considered complete. So the CareerSafe is an online training, so it can be online, but it's done as a group in person at your facility. So everyone is working together, and there must be an instructor present that is qualified in NCCR safety training. So if you have questions about that, please refer to the 2024 grantee manual. The information will be the same in the 2025.
Okay, Dan, quick question before you move on. Robert asked, what are the qualifications to teach the 2 new modulars, the harassment prevention and the diversity and inclusion? And let me just say also real quick, Tammy, yes, Dan is sharing his screen. I don't know, Tammy has said that she's having a problem. She's not able to see the screen if you're sharing, but I am not having a problem with seeing it. So it may be an isolated incident.
Okay. Well, again, regarding the harassment prevention and diversity inclusion training, as well as the other employability skills training, no, we do not set specific credentials for those, although the grantee manual does talk quite a bit about the curriculum and instruction and having qualified instructors. So certainly some of the, depending on your curriculum, whether it's ICCB, MC3, or NCCR Core, you're going to need qualified instructors based on those programs to deliver the instruction. And sometimes the employability skills can be taught by those instructors, and sometimes you might contract outside vendors to do so.
Dan, if I could please add, part of the onboarding that will be done face-to-face in January, we're working on including a train the trainer module for particularly for harassment, the harassment part of it, harassment prevention. And we are working with Chicago Women in Trades to make that curriculum, available for the rest of the grantees. So we will provide some updates related to that, but that is part of what will be included during onboarding.
Are you ready for 2 more questions?
Ready.
So Alejandro asks, so this means if they already have 32 hours of employability skills, they need to add 8 hours of harassment prevention and DI. Or can we replace courses to add the new required courses And Alejandro, if you would like, feel free to unmute yourself to explain further, because I'm not quite sure which courses you would be replacing. So feel free to explain further if you'd like.
Yeah, but the short answer is it's the former. So if you already have 32 hours of employability skills, you must add 8 hours of harassment prevention and diversity and inclusion in construction. So if those 8 hours were already part of your 32, well, then you need to pull those 8 hours out and add back in other employability, 8 hours of employability skills to hit that 32 hours.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Okay, that's it for now.
All right. So moving on, we have safety considerations. So again, this isn't new guidance. This was brought up during our renewal and NOFO meetings last year. But programs must complete their safety trainings during the first 4 weeks of each cohort. This is important because programs begin, hands-on training for, hand tools, power tools, construction lab, and not to mention the worksite learning that I'll address in a moment. They begin all this training, and the participants certainly need to have gone through safety training in order to do those safely and effectively. So it's important to complete those early on in the cohort, and we're stating the first 4 weeks. So OSHA 10 construction and first aid CPR must be completed before the actual worksite learning can begin. So again, that's a very important aspect of it. The worksite learning can be chaotic. That's why it's important for them to get that experience, and they certainly need to have the safety training before then. But again, that's not the only time those individuals will have tools in their hands. This entire program is meant to be experiential learning. And so whether it's, as part of their, training module on tools, or, part of a construction lab practicum, they need to have that safety training in advance. Let's see. And then I think this is the last one for this section, cohort sizes. Cohort sizes will be limited to 30 individuals moving forward. So that applies to whether you're setting that as your goal, or that's where you wind up due to over enrollment. So, oftentimes in the past, organizations may have a cohort enrollment goal of 25 individuals, and you send out 25 invitations to join the cohort. But then you wind up on the first day with 5 people not showing up, right? So now you've under enrolled. So how do organizations compensate for that? Well, they over enroll, right? So instead of sending out just 25 enrollment invitations, they send out 30. And so what we're saying there is that's fine to apply that over enrollment strategy so that you are able to hit your target goal, but you cannot over enroll past 30 individuals. Exceptions for this may be made on a case-by-case basis for school-based programs, depending on their capacity to properly train a cohort of more than 30. Although it should be noted that when we discuss cohorts, we are talking about a group of individuals that are going through the training at the same time in the same location. So that's an important aspect of that. So certainly an organization that has 2 locations, those would be 2 different cohorts. Or maybe it's the same location and one's an AM class and one's a PM class. Again, those are 2 different cohorts, and they would each be subject to their own cohort size limitation.
And then there's a question: is there a minimum to the size of the cohort?
There are practical limitations in terms of what your target goal can be. That's done as part of our administrative onboarding, which I will touch on later. But that's really an understanding of how organizations go through both with the performance-based nature of the funding of this grant and compliance of this grant. Organizations are required to, hit their target goals, or they'll receive reduced funding measures and reduced compliance measures. So that's really the minimum becomes more of a practical discussion of a successful implementation of the program.
Okay, and just one last question. Don asked, what high school-based programs are permitted when the age requirement is 18 plus and high school diploma is required?
So certainly for high school-based programs, they are allowed to operate or allowed to enroll individuals that are not yet 18 and have not yet received their diploma.
Okay.
All right, moving on. We have some common issues that we have identified in many of the applications. And so we're asking all the organizations that have, that are on this group negotiation meeting to go back and check all of these. And again, if there's something that you need to correct, then, provide that correction in your response. If a new document needs to be presented, like a new work plan, you'll send that forward. Otherwise, you can just respond to these and say, work-based learning, no issue. Completion and transition goal, no issue. So let's go through each one of these. So for work-based learning, what we've seen is that, some organizations have built into their curriculum utilizing tours of registered apprenticeship programs, construction trade union halls, in lieu of a job site training. That is not the intent of the Illinois Works Pre-Apprenticeship Program. We do allow organizations that are not able to schedule or coordinate that work site-based learning to utilize those tours as alternatives. But that's done on a case-by-case basis, and programs must provide written requests for those substitute tours. One of the things that we've seen, quite frankly, is that organizations that were given that latitude or grace in 2022 are still operating that way. Those are meant to be short-term substitutes, and with the intent of each organization, providing job site work-based learning for the cohorts. That work-based learning in the grantee manual, it is designated as at least 10 to, I want to say 40 hours. I do know the minimum is 10 hours. And so again, if your organization is not able to schedule that for their first cohort, they could develop a written request to substitute tours. But then they would need to look at that if they are running a second cohort or a third cohort for the year. They need to be prepared to host that job site training. Any questions on this before I move on?
No questions, Dan.
Okay. So completion and transition goals. So this is there's some math, and then there's some tricky math to it. But all organizations essentially set their enrollment goal, right? And that's really what your budget is based on. But for the most part, in your NOFO applications, the organization got to determine what your enrollment goal would be. Maybe it's 20 people, maybe it's 25, maybe it's 50. From there, the program sets your completion and transition goals, right? So your completion goal must be 85% of whatever your enrollment goal is. And your transition goal must be 70% of whatever your enrollment goal is. So let's take a look at that. So in this first table, we can see, again, there is no goal calculation for the enrollment because you set that. And in this example, they set that at 25. So then for completion, it must be 85% of that enrollment goal. So 85% of 25. In this case, and I'm doing this from memory, I think that's something like 85% of 25 is 21.2. So we use standard rounding procedures. So if it's less than 0.5, you round down. If it's 0.5 or more, you round up. So in this case, you would round down to 21. So the total completion goal would be 21. The primary transition goal is 70% of the enrollment goal. And again, the enrollment goal is 25. So in this case, you round up to 18. So those are your overall goals in this hypothetical, grant application. This particular grantee is looking, or this particular applicant is looking to run 2 cohorts. So they need to split those total enrollment, completion, and transition goals between the 2 cohorts. So you'll see in cohort 1, they've selected an enrollment goal of 12, and in cohort 2, an enrollment goal of 13. 12 plus 13 totals that 25 enrollment goal. Similarly, for completion, they have to split the 21. You do not go ahead and say, well, 85% of 12 for cohort 1 means this completion, and for cohort 2, 85% of 13 means this completion. Those calculations were done on the total enrollment and the total completion and the total primary transition. So I've highlighted for cohort 1 the transition goal of 9. And that's a big difference, because if you were to take 70% of 12, you would only wind up with 8 transitions. But that would not then conform to the overall total goal of needing 18. So that's why I said it does get a little tricky, because first you're doing some rounding and then you're splitting it between 1, 2, or 3 cohorts. So keep that in mind. If you have any questions, again, you can reach out to us, but hopefully this provided an explanation of how that should work. So all organizations should go back to their work plans and ensure that those are, the math was done correctly. If not, correct it and resubmit your work plans. Keep in mind that that your goals ultimately influence your budgets. So any updates to that may be necessary as well. Any question on the completion and transition goals?
So Janelle did ask a question, and she'd like you to give an example of how planning for over enrollment of 30 students instead of 25 would work with completion and transition goals.
They do not impact your goals, right? Those are things, over enrollment, under enrollment, those are your percentage of attainment to goal, not your goals themselves. So they don't have anything to do with this. Right now, you're setting your goals, and then, while you run your cohort, again, maybe you're going to extend invitations to 29 people for enrollment. Maybe only 24 show up, right? So again, that 29 didn't have an impact on what we're showing on this screen on your work plan. Ultimately what we wind up verifying are 24. That's going to ultimately influence what we refer to as your compliance and your performance funding, but that is not something that gets impacted with your when you're initially setting your work plan goals or your budgets.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
There are no more questions.
All right. So moving on to the next one, we have barrier reduction funds. So this is something that we have, been working toward to helping our grantees realize in their budgets. It's beneficial to include your wraparound services, your student support services, and your transition services as a single line item titled Barrier Reduction Funds in the budget. This is because if you separate them, then you limit yourself to that specific category, right? If you were to have a separate category for wraparound services and transition services, but then you wind up maxing out all of their transition service budget, but underutilizing your wraparound service budget, you have unnecessarily hamstrung your ability to support the participants of the program. So by doing this, you're able to create a more general barrier reduction fund line item. So your narratives, and again, your narratives on your budgets are extremely important. The narrative should explain that the barrier reduction fund is made up of the wraparound service, student support service, and transition services as required by the Office of Illinois Works. You can find out more about what those services are in the 2024 grantee manual that was made available on the NOFO page. The narrative should also explain how you're arriving at a barrier reduction funding total. So this example is that the barrier reduction fund is an average of $400 for 40 students, totaling $16,000, right? So a couple important things to note here. Again, that 40, that would be based off of your enrollment goal. So if you had an enrollment goal of 50, then it should say 50 students. If you have an enrollment goal of 20, it should say 20 students. The $400 there, again, I just pulled that out of thin air. It's what your program believes that the demographics that you will serve will need in terms of overall support. So each program needs to come up with their own funding level for that. But it's important to state an average, because we do not want, again, you to be held to a limit for a given student. One student might not need any support, any wraparound, student support, transition services support, while another might need twice the average, right? And so by placing that as your narrative, that allows you flexibility to support the students as they need it. Any questions about this barrier reduction fund budget line?
Nothing in the chat.
Okay. The last statement I will make on that is barrier reduction funds, for our purpose here, stipends are a different line item, right? So when we talk about these barrier reduction funds, we recognize that in general terms, stipends do help reduce barriers, but for the purposes of this, we are talking about wraparound services, student support services, and transition services, and stipends do receive their own line item. So speaking of those stipends, this is outside of the budget. This is talking about the stipend policies, right? So stipends must follow the Illinois Works stipend guidance. There's an example stipend policy in the 2024 grantee manual. Of course, when we update to the 2025 manual, all of the information that I'm talking about will also be in there. But it's important to note that stipends must always be based on instructional hours. They must also be dependent upon performance. And then this third sentiment, that they must be paid at the same rate for all hours of curriculum. So what that's saying is, if you have the current maximum is $14.50 per hour, but I'm just going to use I'm going to say, let's say your program stipend is going to be $12 an hour. Well, that $12 an hour applies to whether they are in their OSHA 10 training, whether they're in their first aid CPR training, whether they're doing their first week of construction math, their last week of construction math, that work-based learning on-site job training, they're all paid at that same rate, right? What that also means is that there cannot be external incentives, right? So what we're seeing is that some organizations are saying, oh, okay, well, I will pay $10 an hour for the instruction component, and then we'll pay $100 for every post assessment that they successfully complete, or we'll pay $150 for every module that they complete. That we can't allow because it separates the stipend being based on the instruction hour, and it completely separates the two. So then you essentially have a instruction hour, or you have a wage for hours, and then you have performance incentives. So stipends cannot be a wage. They must be all put together. So your stipend policy would need to reflect that. Programs must submit their Illinois Works pre-apprenticeship program stipend policy during what we call administrative onboarding. I'll explain that in just a moment. You can use the example stipend policy that we provide in the grantee manual, or you can use your own stipend policy. Again, it will be reviewed and approved either way, or unapproved, right? It'll be reviewed for approval, I should say. And so those must be submitted at the beginning of each year during administrative onboarding. So let me just briefly explain what administrative onboarding is. At the beginning of the grant year, all organizations that have been awarded a grant will be assigned a programmatic grant manager. You will meet with that grant manager one-on-one via WebEx, and we will perform an onboarding where we discuss your marketing plan, your staffing plans, your curriculum, do what we call a final curriculum form, where your curriculum is essentially set in stone and it gets loaded into our web-based database, Illinois Works reporting system. We identify the key contacts for financial emails. We identify the key contacts for transition emails, for instructor emails, things like that. So that's an onboarding meeting that we hold with all organizations, and so that's when we would be approving or reviewing things like the stipend policy. So any questions about that?
Then I believe Tamika does.
Hi, it was easier to say this one rather than type it. So the stipends being dependent upon performance, but removing the ability for the program to use or reserve a portion of the stipend dollars for incentives based on performance. Can you just explain then how the instructions per hour align with the performance also, if we're not also seeing that they get through that modules post the test?
So it can be related to that stipend per. So let's say you had a 10-hour, a 10-hour training module, and the you have a set stipend per hour, amount, and then you are awarding that stipend based on successful completion of that post assessment, but you're reducing that that stipend payment by a certain amount if they do not pass their performance evaluation. So it's still tied into their overall, stipend hourly rate, but it's reducing it by a certain amount rather than just being a separate add-on incentive.
And just to clarify, this is something that is not part of the the flags that must be cleared. This is something we'll be able to work through with our specific grant manager post award during that admin phase, correct?
That's a good question. Essentially, when we send out the email, it will list this stipend and what we'd be looking for organizations to just simply respond that they will follow the Illinois Works stipend guidance and provide a policy during their administrative onboarding. So yes, thank you for bringing that up. That is one of the ways in which some of these flags might be cleared when we're talking about adhering to guidance.
Okay, Dan, two additional questions. So Najee asked, what if we are required to pay a progressive increasing wage by US DOL Rapids registration?
So, if I'm understanding that correctly, I think that's referring to when an individual is in a registered apprenticeship program. This, of course, is for a pre-apprenticeship program. Individuals are not enrolled into Rapids at this time, so the participants would not be subject to those same requirements. So Najee, if you have additional anything you want to add to that, oh, okay.
And she said thanks. And then the next one is, what do you mean when you say stipends aren't wages? And I had started typing a response, but go for it, Dan. I can read from the manual. It's there.
Well, if you have the manual in front of you, by all means, but wages are typically, so a couple things. Stipends can be paid to an individual for say a work-based learning, and training. Wages, they cannot replace an individual that is receiving wages as employment, right? So that to me has always been a way of looking at it, that if you have an employee and they're earning a certain amount and you hire somebody else and replace that employee, and employee one leaves and employee two stays and does that job, those were both employees, right? But if you have employee one and an Illinois Works participant comes in and shadows them, assists them, etc., employee one will still receive their full wage. Employee two, or not employee two, the Illinois Works participant is receiving a stipend to learn and train and not perform the actual job, even if they're doing some of the work as part of their learning and training. So that's one way of interpreting it. Ultimately, the IRS is the one determining and classifying employees receiving wages, right? Versus a student receiving a stipend. And it's important to note that they are students and not employees. I think, you just provided that.
And if I could please add here, because we are a pre-apprenticeship program, we should never use the word wages when it comes to stipends. Please read the grantee manual. There's a whole section there on why that is the case, and it has to do with federal law and regulation. We do not pay wages, we pay stipends, and we need to ensure that that is the case. And the terminology needs to be stipends. No wage language is to ever be used with pre-apprenticeship programs. So if you could please read the grantee manual, page 99 that Monica just mentioned, it's very, very important that we do that.
Excellent. That was everything I had. Any further questions? Any last couple of questions?
Nothing additional in the chat.
Well, perfect. If you do have any questions, please email the Illinois Works Peer Apprenticeship Program grant managers. Listed are my and Monica's email addresses. Again, everyone that attended this will receive a copy of this slide deck. We will also make the recording available as soon as we have it. And I will outline in the email as well, what needs to be addressed and how it can be addressed. Again, some of your organizations maybe did not have any issues with their work plan. All of your 85% completion and 70% transition were fine, so there will be nothing for you to do there. Others might need to resubmit that. I'll make that clear in the email that we have. So Norman, any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
No, just wanted to thank everybody. We appreciate you joining us today. And as we mentioned earlier, if you are one of those grantees that has more flags that need to be addressed, we either have already reached out to you to schedule a one-on-one meeting, or we will reach out to you to schedule a one-on-one meeting. But other than that, we just want to make sure we address this as soon as possible, get going, and then ensure that we proceed to clearing those flags so that we can then make recommendations to the director. As I mentioned, that is on the 26th of November, and that is the reason why we need a quick turnaround here. So thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.